Good afternoon, everyone. I am Debbie Hart, the President and CEO of BioNJ, and I'd like to welcome you and thank you for joining us for how end user adoption is key to software deployment success, brought to you in partnership with BioNJ member Control Associates. We're very grateful to Control for supporting this session today. So today's discussion is being recorded and will be available tomorrow at bionj.org. So we encourage you to ask questions and engage in today's conversation. You can type your comments and questions in the Q&A box. So to lead the discussion today, I'd like to ask you to please welcome today's moderator, Vice President Program Management for INSMED, and the Chair of the Committee for Project Management at BioNJ, Suzanne Brown. Suzanne, welcome and take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Debbie. Today, I think we're going to have a great discussion about how critically important user acceptance is as we start to deploy software development. So we're going to start this off by talking a little bit to each of our panelists. And so I'll open it up with you, Paula. Tell us a little bit about yourself and what kinds of projects you've implemented.
I have over 25 years of experience in the IT and project management world. I've implemented over 35 systems during that time, LIMS systems, ERP systems, inventory tracking systems, electronic batch record systems, and things like that.
So I'm sure this topic is very near and dear to your heart as far as user acceptance.
It is. And another system that we did was an RTMS system, which is real-time modeling system for scheduling in the manufacturing space. So, yeah.
Great. Thank you. So, Tony, I'll ask you the same question. Tell me a little bit. Tell me a little bit about yourself and what are some of the projects that you've implemented.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Tony Dijon. I've got about 30 years experience in process control and process data. I've worked the majority of my career in life sciences, but have also supported other industries as well. At Control Associates, I get the privilege of leading a services team that implements software deployments for things like process control, EBR, and process data needs, right? So we'll work on projects such as DCS and PLCs. We'll work on electronic workflow projects such as MES, batch records and batch reporting and EBR, and also process data related projects such as data collection, data aggregation, data contextualization, and then visualization.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I have some questions that I'm going to throw out there, but I really want to have more of a dialogue than a Q&A per se. So I'll start with just talking about some of the typical causes that cause projects to go off track. Paula, you may want to start and then please let's just have a dialogue around that.
Okay, so one of the main key points on a project is SOPs, URSs, FDSs. So a URS is a user requirement specification document, and FDS is a functional diagram and functional design spec. So those things have to be done. End user SOPs are not given enough notification that these have to be updated or created. They take a lot of time. Every project needs to allow for at least 40 days for that to be created or updated and to go through your approval processes and become effective. Anything you're doing, whether it's GMP or non-GMP, those new processes cannot go into effect without SOPs being effective. The other big thing is not having SMEs dedicated to a project. That is a huge downfall on a lot of projects. People are wearing multiple hats, and if you don't have that SME time, you cannot effectively get that system out and deployed in a timely manner.
Yeah. And why do you think that is? Is it because we're trying to, SMEs are more focused on their individual day job, or what's your experience telling you there?
Day job. This is an add-on. So my most successful projects are where a business can bring in other people to do a lot of the heavy lift on that SME's day-to-day tasks so that the SME can be more dedicated to the project. that SME knowledge cannot be replaced. And you really need that. You need that end user buy-in, and your SMEs getting in, getting familiar with the system, getting that buy-in, going to their colleagues and asking for input is really important. Projects should be, with relation to software, should be bottom up, in my opinion. Yes, you have to get those output requirements from your management team, but your day-to-day users have to really give good input on what are their pain points, what do they need changed, how does their process work. And then the other thing is, implementing a system requires change. You've got to identify how can you make changes and improvements to your business process and really champion that, and have champions in your business that champion those things out so that your users know what's in it for them, why are these changes occurring, and how are we going to improve their day-to-day work life.
That's great. Thanks. Tony, your perspective.
Yeah, I think the idea of the SME is huge, right? Just that idea of, is there someone on the business side who could really articulate what the business needs, the pain points, and really the requirements of whatever this solution is going to provide them, right? I feel like a big thing that causes projects to go off track. I mean, it's easy to say sort of scope change, but I think when you really drill into what scope change means, a lot of times I think it means sort of evolution of requirements, where sometimes people can sort of think about something, especially if it's like a data or like an L3 related project, where it's a bit abstract until people start getting some runtime. And as people get runtime, I think they're naturally going to start evolving their requirements and expanding on their requirements. And also even like between, when you think about sort of an end user who's kind of articulating what their needs are, and at some point there's a developer who's trying to stand up a solution that's going to meet their needs. How well are they connected? How well are they aligned, right? Does that developer really understand what's being articulated, right? And I think that's where like that idea of the SME who can really articulate what's going on with the business and what the needs are. And also like almost like a business analyst too, somebody who kind of has one foot in each world to sort of link the two together between the end user and the person who's doing the development.
Yeah, that's really insightful. I heard, I think Paula, you mentioned change, but why do you think people are so resistant to change? We go through a lot of support for new systems to be implemented, but end users don't always adopt the system, right? So is it resistance to change, or what do you think really drives that?
Change is hard. New is difficult. New is difficult to grasp, and they can't see the whole process. That's why Agile works so much better, or a hybrid Agile waterfall method, because you can have deliverables short term. So Tony mentioned scope change. To me, scope is going to change as your project evolves, and it should, because if you're doing deliverables along the way, then the business can see, okay, yes, this meets our need, or our need has changed. Software implementation does not typically happen in 3 or 6 months. It usually takes a year to 2 years. And during that time, the business need is going to change, and the project has to be able to pivot and make that change. But change is hard. So people are not good at visualizing that. They really need to be able to get in as soon as possible, start playing with the system and understanding how that's going to relate to their day-to-day work.
Yeah. So Tony, talk to us a little bit about the Agile methodology. How do you achieve this? Why is it better? What's your perspective?
Yeah, I think without getting like all caught up on a lot of the terminology around it, just if you've got software that you're trying to roll out or a solution you're trying to roll out that's relatively new for the organization, right? Not something that you've done like, oh, we've done this 4 or 5 times already and we kind of really understand our requirements, right? If it's something relatively new, I think it's really helpful if you could plan to implement in stages, right? Meaning that let's not try to boil the ocean from the beginning. Let's try to figure out, is there something small we can get out quickly? Because if people see it and get some runtime, they're going to start really understanding their requirements even better, right? As they understand sort of the capabilities of the software and what their real needs are and how they're going to fit it kind of into their work practice, right? So I think the idea of saying, look, let's plan to deploy in stages. Let's do something small in the beginning, get a little more runtime. Then we'll reiterate a little bit, right? And I think, as Paula said, like maybe you're going to expect a little bit of rework of requirements from that first stage to your second stage. and then hopefully build on that and put a little more capability, and then maybe do it again and even again if needed.
Mm. And have you seen change resistance come down significantly by using an agile methodology?
I I don't know that the resistance to change and agile are always completely related, right? I mean,
Yep.
I think it helps, but I think the biggest thing that agile is going to do, especially in if you're rolling out in like some snippets, it's going to try to foster the engagement with the end users. Because I feel like a big reason why people won't adopt is maybe they never really felt like they sort of owned the solution,
Mm-hmm.
right? It might feel like
Yeah.
almost like, well, IT's pushing this on me, right?
Right.
And it's not like, hey, this is mine, right? To me, it's like IT really is the steward of the platform to make sure that the platform is secure and has backup and recovery and is sort of properly rolled out and maintained. But hopefully you have an SME on the business side who really feels that sense of ownership that says, no, this application is to serve our needs.
Mm. Yeah. So, we've talked about the resistance sometimes to change. Paula, I'd love to hear a little bit more of your experience about how do we fix this, right? You mentioned SMEs, you mentioned user documentation, but what as an end user of a new system? And I guess really this is a question for both of you, both from an end user and, really providing the software can we do to help soften the resistance to change? As you stated, change is really hard and everyone adopts it very differently.
So Tony's already mentioned a business analyst. Every project that's successful has a really good business analyst that is not just a SME type person who understands the system and understands their businesses, but can work with the business and work with the end users and really make the end users feel like their voice is being heard and it's important, showing the end users what's in it for them, how this process is changing, but we've listened to you, we've listened to your pain points, and here's how it's going to improve your work life. Making sure that time is spent with those end users to really identify how do they work? Mm-hmm. What do they need in a system that makes them feel appreciated and makes them feel heard? And you can't skip those steps.
Yeah. Tony, anything you would add to that?
Yeah, I agree. And I think we all have to recognize that even a really good solution, even a really well-designed, well-thought-out software application, it's still disruptive, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's still going to come in and change how people work and
right.
do. And I think a lot of times projects will be so focused on saying, well, we have to do training and we have to have an SOP, but a lot of times people will focus on the technical just to say, okay, this is how you drive it and this is how you operate it. But then I think, Paul, you kind of were bringing this up earlier on, is the idea of how do I work with it, right? What are my work practices and how are they going to be impacted? What are my SOPs for not so much how I just govern the software, but my SOPs around how are people going to do that work now using this new solution?
Yeah. Yeah, and we've thrown around some acronyms just for some clarity. SME, subject matter expert. For those, we live in an environment where we throw out acronyms so globally that we think everyone understands. But SME is subject matter expert. Now we know that systems aren't always isolated to just one system. There are many integration points with other systems because we have a complex universe. When do you include integrations? Into a project deployment?
I'll answer that question and then let Tony follow up. You need to identify your downstream integrations that are very critical and important at the beginning of your project. That's crucial. Users should not have to re-enter data into multiple systems, if at all possible. And you need to identify any type of ETL, which is extract, transfer, and load work that will have to be done, security type systems, things like that have to be changed. So integrations is so important to understand what is your overall company integration plan and how does this new system fit into it? Where can you feed data from a master system to downstream systems? Integrations is critical, and that really makes your data accurate, and it lifts a heavy burden off of reviewing and approving and those types of work streams.
Yeah, Tony, any add to that?
Yeah, Paul, this might be the one place that's come up that I don't know if we're completely aligned on. No, but the integrations, I don't want to, yes, I underscore how important they are, right? And important it is to get them right. Unfortunately, they bring a lot of complexity, right? They bring a lot of complexity around how is your network architected? How are you getting data from A to B and things like that, right? So there's a lot that has to be kind of thought through. To me, it's just, I think identifying what you want to integrate at the point when you're done is important. But then again, I sort of come back to, can you get something simple out there quickly, right? Because I think overall that's going to really help the requirements development and help the requirements to evolve a little faster. And that might mean, I think somebody has to just sort of prioritize and say, okay, is it more important to get all the integrations and every single thing done? And do we want to do that up front? But that's going to slow things down, right? So maybe if you can get something simple out faster, then that might speed things along a little bit.
I agree with you, Tony, but you do need to understand what are those integrations that are going to occur so that IT and the business isn't blindsided at the end of the project and going, oh, this is going to cost us $100,000 more because we didn't develop this right to do those types of integrations. So I wasn't trying to say to do the integrations up front, but to identify them, to really understand where do you want to connect things? What's your 5-year plan? You may not be planning to integrate Pi Historian today, but in 2 years you are. So if your developer understands that and knows that up front, they can have that in their mindset as they're developing it so that future connections and integrations can occur. So that's what I was going at, not so much as slowing down that, getting something out for the user, but understanding where you're going on your roadmap.
Yeah, that totally makes sense.
Yeah, that's great. So not all of our users are a one size fits all, right? So how do we tailor deployments when we have a diverse set of user groups with a whole variety of different skills? What works best in your experiences? Tony, you want to take that first?
Yeah, I guess if let's say you're just deploying sort of an enterprise solution, but multiple locations are going to use it, and they just maybe they have slightly different requirements or slightly different capabilities at different sites. Those are a lot of drivers for why some of the deployments have to be tailored a little bit. In my mind, things like you may want to plan for a different approach to hypercare, right? Maybe the first time that the software gets deployed at a site, just to say, look, instead of just saying we're going to do like 4 weeks or 6 weeks or something like that, you might want to make it a little bit more metrics based. To say, look, no, we're really not going to call hypercare done until the end users are a little bit more established. The other thing is maybe something like consider cross training. If somebody's at one site who is getting the software that they don't have yet, but maybe another site has it. Is there any window for some of the end users to do some cross training or shadowing? Not always, but if there could be a little bit, I think that would help.
Yeah. Any insights from you, Paula?
You can't make a system that meets everybody's needs usually, but if you can add in that flexibility and have things appear based on templates. So if you select A, then you get fields D, E, and F. So being able to build that in is really good. But you don't always have that ability, especially if you're going with an off-the-shelf solution and you only want to stay out of the box. But where that can happen, it's really important to try and make that flexibility. It reduces a lot of confusion to the end user. Making things usability for the end user is really important because they're going to be in it day to day. Looking at your commonalities up front, if you have that opportunity, is really good because then you can identify what's common, but what's different for each area. So if you have 3 different types of labs, say you have a forensics lab, you have a drug development lab, and you have a research development lab, identifying what are the commonalities across those labs and what are the differences. And I like to, and I'm very different on this, I like to tackle the 20% then do the 80%, because what's different is that 20%, and that's what can blow up your project and blow up your application, because that 20%, well, it's only 20%, it's really important. That 20% I find over and over is really critical and really important. So I like to tackle the 20%, what's different, what's hard, what's not going to work so well, and then the 80%, these are the common things. These are the things we need across the board.
Yeah, absolutely. So since COVID, our world has changed as far as being more remote than more office based. How does that impact the deployment of a system and user acceptance? Have you seen a change with that, or is that just part of the way we work?
I'll respond first. So for me, it really hasn't impacted a lot because developers typically are behind a wall. They do not interact a lot with the user. They interact a lot with your business analyst or your user designer, things like that, your UX designer. So, and they prefer to be in their own dark little office and don't come bug me. So I'm used to working with them very remotely. I'm also used to working with end users remotely. I think what's really important, though, even since COVID, is to either have a meeting where everybody has their cameras on and you have a whiteboard and things like that when you're talking through things and trying to especially gather requirements, or to be able to be on site during those meetings, those work sessions. And I think if you can have longer work sessions and fewer work sessions, that really drives the project because it helps people, an hour-long meeting is difficult because they're just starting to get their brains engaged and going, and then all of a sudden it's done, and then you got to pick up at the next meeting. So trying to have, even 4-hour work sessions and only having a couple of them, I find more productive.
Yeah. Tony, your perspective?
Yeah, I think very similar, right? I think remote execution is okay, right? Once the developers really understand what they need to deliver. But there's key parts of a project that if they could be done face to face is so much easier. Any of the really sort of collaborative whiteboarding sessions, really the requirements intake and understanding the requirements, being able to tease out some of the subtleties, right? I think a lot of what might lead to that 20%, right? Is that it could be very hard to tease out, especially when a group is starting to get to know each other, just doing remotely. But I think once you get past those things, then I think a lot of things can be done remote after that. Personally for me, like I really struggle trying to do whiteboarding remotely, right? Versus just being in a room, right? It's really like spending more time on the technology than what I'm actually trying to show.
Yeah. And have you had situations, from a cultural perspective or organizational differences from site to site where you've encountered unexpected, issues with the success of a deployment? How do you adapt to that? How do different users culturally and in a different organization, different sites within an organization adopt, and how do you work with those differences? Tony, you want to try that one first? And
Yeah.
the
I
cultural
guess this
questions
is
are always hard, right? So
hopefully this is where that business analyst, that person who's
Yeah.
sort of that bridge between the two groups really can try to understand when there's a big difference going to a different site. And a lot of times it's just because their needs may be not exactly the same, right? And
Yeah.
it's not always one size fits all. But then like that, hopefully that BA could try to sort of balance between, okay, we got to give them something that's valuable, right? They have to have value out of the solution at the end of the day. But then you're also trying to balance things like, is this part of a larger program? Am I trying to keep a similar look and feel sort of from one site to another? It's a lot to consider.
Data architecting is really important. How you architect that solution on the back end drives how flexible that front end can be for your users at different sites and meeting those user needs while meeting the ability to roll up that data so that upper management's able to see things all together. So data architecting, and I know that's something we haven't talked about, is really important. Being flexible in time zones and learning and understanding. There are some cultures that they say yes, and in the US, yes means I'm going to do that. And other cultures, it means I understand what you're telling me. It's not an affirmation of I'm going to do this. It's an affirmation of I hear you. I understand what you're saying. So learning those things, and if you're not sure, asking, being polite and asking, say, okay, I want to make sure I'm understanding what you're trying to convey. And making sure you walk away, everybody walks away from the table understanding things together, because it's every individual person's interpretation of what's being said, whether it's an email, it's in Teams, or it's even verbally. Everybody hears and understands things differently. So making sure everybody at the end of that meeting understands and where you're going, and that everybody feels comfortable voicing their concerns or voicing their opinions. That's one thing I love about Scrum and love about doing Agile, is having those daily stand-ups and getting people to communicate, even if it's just 15 minutes, hearing those communications and stuff. Getting people to understand to be flexible on time zones. When you work globally, it becomes even a bigger challenge. And I've worked in that space for over 15 years, and it really can become very challenging. If you are working with Brisbane, Australia, and you're working with Groningen, Netherlands, well, they are on opposite polar of the time zone. So really trying to get everybody to come together and understand that, somebody's going to be up in the middle of the night, unfortunately, but working with that.
Yeah.
And then working with offshore developers can be a challenge sometimes, but you can work through those processes too.
Yeah. It sounds like the dialogue and the really understanding the user requirements, and then going back and asking the question over again and again until you really get to that, seems to be a critical success factor. Is that right?
Yes, 3 times minimum. You really, and probably more than that. And the sooner you can do a visual tool to show them, okay, this is what we've heard that you're asking for, the sooner you can visualize that for them and have them kind of play with it, the better you're going to get those requirements back. Having somebody who's really good with the URS development and can work with the business in developing those URSs and teasing out those complex things that might be different between sites is really, really important. And having that before you're not trying to provide the solution at that time. You're trying to provide, what do you need in this solution? And then let IT go off and come back with, here's the best solution. Will this work for you?
Right. And URS, user requirement specification.
Yes.
Yep. Okay, great.
Sorry.
Tony, yeah, no worries. Tony, anything else you would add?
Not really. No, I agree though. But a lot of times in these meetings, I may just ask the question, or somebody says something and I'll say, okay, let me just rephrase it or say it back to you in my own words and tell me where I'm wrong, right? Because that idea of just saying, look, are we on the same page? Are we really getting each other?
Yeah. So go ahead, Paula,
Another
please.
thing is, if you have examples of outputs, what outputs are they wanting? I mean, examples of that is so helpful for making sure that you're going to develop a good solution.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. How, we've talked a little bit about, I guess maybe what we're hearing, give a little bit more of a definition, Tony, on the Agile process, right? So we had a question pop up from one of the participants to talk about Agile, a little bit more of an overview, and how it works. Can you do that in, I know it's a big process, there's probably lots of explanation, but, in a few key sentences?
Yeah, I mean, I guess to contrast it, right? I mean, waterfall is more like saying, we're going to do one pass at this. We're going to sit down, we're going to collect requirements, we're going to work on a solution, we're going to put the solution in front of people, go through some comment review, and hopefully call it a day after that, right? But that takes a very, very long time. It's a really long requirements gathering session. It's a really, really long development time. And then, now people are totally disengaged. Months have gone by, and all of a sudden you're bringing a solution back to them, right?
Yep.
Agile is really just saying, look, we're gonna carve this out into small sprints, and we're going to keep the team very focused in those sprints. We're going to go away and develop for a little while, and then we're going to come back and show you something very quickly, right? But we're going to plan to do it in multiple short iterations.
That's great. Thank you for doing that. What, how do we measure success when, end user success? That's kind of the $1 million question. How do we measure that success? Do we build in those success criteria early in the process so we know what we're trying to achieve at the end? What's your experience has been?
My experience has been that we build that out up front along with doing your risk assessment. And when I'm not talking about if somebody can't do something when a risk assessment, I'm talking about if this product does not perform or doesn't do X, Y, Z.
Yep.
You then take that risk assessment and you can add metrics to it. Those metrics will evolve. So as you go along with the project and the project evolves, your metrics of what is success and what is considered done
Mm-hmm.
might evolve some, but what is considered done should be really identified at the beginning with those user requirements. You know, as a user, I need X, Y, and Z, and I need it to do this, this, and this is really important because then you have something to check off and say, okay, we've met this requirement, and the function is performing the way they want it to. Then you have that usability testing, and then you have users coming back at the end and letting you know what are their pain points, what do they like, what's working well for them. And if you can give them a short survey, and when I say short, I mean not more than 15 questions,
Mm-hmm.
to really identify what do you want to make sure is working right based off of those user requirements and the functional design requirements is really, really helpful.
Mm. That's great. Tony, anything else you would add to that?
I'd say almost I think
Almost the
first off,
same. Yeah.
having an ROI defined at the beginning of the project is it's always good practice, right? Just
Yep.
know to say, okay, what's the return the org expects to get on the
Yep.
investment of time and money and whatnot that they're going to put into this effort, and having at least some framework of saying how we're going to measure this when we're done. I think having that up front, I agree with Paul. Like you really want to have that. And then after that, other things I guess I would think about is that I think if you have what I would call like sort of a healthy amount of change in the requirements, really more like evolution of the requirements.
Mm-hmm.
Hopefully we're not at the point where we're just like, we're a few months in and saying, oh no, this is all wrong. We got to start all over again, right? Hopefully you're not there. But I think you don't really want to get to the end of the project on something very new and say, wow, we got no changes to the requirements at all. So that means we either completely knocked it out of the park or people aren't really engaged in thinking about it.
Yeah. So what's the role of training and the importance of training, the importance of change management along the agile process? And where do you see the training and change management component really helping with end user adoption?
Good training documentation that's visual, as well as wording, not too much wording. Being able to have hands-on training is really helpful.
Yeah.
Even if it's not led, even if it's just they go to a site, they can step through and now do this, now do that. I think that's helpful, but don't train too soon, because if they can't get their heads in a dev environment and at least start playing with what they've learned, you're not going to get feedback and you're not going to get adoption, because if you train a year before you launch, they've forgotten everything because they have too much else going on. So don't train too soon, but good training documentation is really important.
Yeah. And maybe Tony, this question could be for you. We reach not only organizations, but some of our deployments are in our clinical offices where we're doing clinical trials with physicians, and even to the patient, where the clinical participant is using a software application at home that we have deployed. How do we build that into ensuring that they're getting the support that they need? We're building that into the development, trying to understand how they may be using different applications or using the application differently. Is that something that you take into account when you're working through the agile process?
I think you really have to pressure test your solution at some point to say, okay, what are the modes where things can sort of fail, right?
Yep.
And unfortunately, I think you're probably not going to catch all of them from the beginning, but you do have to challenge yourself to think about it as a team and say, okay, let's at least come up with the ones that we perceive to say, if I lose connectivity, what's this going to do? Or if somebody enters data twice, what's it going to do? How is it going to behave?
Yeah.
Or if somebody's just lost and they need help, what is their pathway to get help?
Yeah.
I think you got to try to just pressure test and look for different modes of failure.
Yeah. Okay. And hypercare, what's the, is that also an important element of that?
I would say, yeah, definitely, especially on something that's brand new. To just say, look, we're gonna plan, we're gonna budget and staff to make sure that we've got people highly available who could be very, very responsive and help the users along, and also record the issues and be prepared to make changes quickly.
Right. Yeah. Paul, you were about ready to jump off mute a couple of times. You were going to add something.
Yeah, I was just agreeing with Tony on that. But also having a good tester that can test the product and think like a user would. They're not going to do everything as a user would do, but those critical points to be able to think like a user and how would a user perceive the system. If you have the ability to work with subsets of users to do usability testing and things like that, especially when you're dealing with the public, if you can have people volunteer to look at the system and provide input and feedback is really, really good.
Yeah, really important. Particularly as you think about patients potentially using an application to record their how they feel, etc. It could be really confusing for those individuals, and really having that tested ahead of time, it will be really important.
It's also good if you have the opportunity to have somebody review your documentation and go through all the steps who's never used the system. They've not been exposed to the system, because when the person who's writing that documentation, they've been exposed to it, they know what they're supposed to be writing about. But there's a lot of steps that get missed because we just inherently, we know how to do it. But those are critical steps. So think about when you get a piece of furniture and you want to put it together, and there's steps that if they had been outlined, it would have made it easier. So just having a tester who can test that documentation, whether it's for the public or it's for internal use, who's not familiar with the system, is really good, because they're going to be able to call out, wait, this step wasn't here. It wasn't clear what I needed to do. So I think that's really, really important.
Yeah, that's really good insight. So we've talked a lot about this so far, as far as success factors, but I'd like to hear this from each of you. What do you consider those 3 most critical success factors for successful software deployment? Tony, yeah.
So I'd say, like, the 3 that are on my mind would be, first is an engaged team, like meaning everybody's coming to the table, people want to work on this project, right? And they want to put some time on this project. And it's got to be all parties, right? And when I say that, I'm thinking it's that if IT is leading it or leading a lot of the process or whatnot, but then the business really has to have that commitment and that sense of ownership. In addition to that, if it's a GMP application, then QA's got to be on board, that they're going to be supporting the project. And then the vendor as well, right? Or whoever's going to be doing the implementation of the development, right? So, like, that whole team collectively has got to be engaged. The other thing I'd say is maybe just alignment of key topics. And key topics in my mind are, realistically, what can the solution is it going to be capable of? What things is it not going to be capable of, right? So just sort of hopefully being able to come to agreement on that and have alignment around it. And then the other alignment is around roles and responsibilities of the team members, right? So people kind of know, okay, this is what's expected of me. This is what's not expected of me, but expected of somebody else, right? And then the last piece I would say is, as much as possible, face-to-face for the key activities, right? The requirements gatherings, the workshops, things like that. We've talked about that already.
Okay, that's great. Paula, what about you?
Team is really important. Having that good mix of team members, users all the way up to management is really, really important. You have to have users who feel comfortable speaking up, letting them know that, just because management's here, management wants to hear your voice and what you need. Why identifying why the change, why is the software going to meet the needs? Why was it chosen? Why are we doing this? What is the purpose? And I think that's really important. And I think every communication you send out has to have the why. Why are we making this change? How will it benefit you? What's in it for me? So those communications going out to users is really important. And then outputs. What are at the end of the day, what are the outputs we're driving for?
Mm,
and
yeah.
making sure that we are able to deliver on that.
Mm. You mentioned senior management. Talk a little bit about the importance of sponsorship.
Sponsorship's critical because if you have huddles across your organization, things like that, they disseminate information. They disseminate that they're supportive of it, that this is something that they've heard the users have an issue and they need this, along with here's how it will benefit the business overall. So having those stakeholders from middle management all the way up be on board and just really align on what is the driver for the project and why, and communicating that out constantly is really, really important because it makes the users feel like, okay, we're going to develop a product or we're going to purchase a product that's going to meet our needs, and management's all in on this and they're going to support it. This also helps, if you have your management on board, then they're supportive of your end user time to the project and your subject matter experts' time on the project.
Yeah. And do you see that as well, Tony? I'm sure you have engaged with a lot of the sponsorship of various programs.
Yeah, I mean the sponsorship at the end of the day is gonna buy in to apply the resources, right? And make sure that the resources are gonna be available. And sometimes, sometimes escalations are needed, right? Sometimes the team can't always come to an agreement on some of the complex issues. Hopefully there's not many of them, but there could be some occasionally. And at that point, it might have to get escalated to a stakeholder who could be a decision maker.
Yeah. Yeah. We talked a little bit about when we're measuring the success, building those success criteria in early. You mentioned ROI, return on investment. How do you balance the short-term ROI with long-term benefits as well, and keeping an eye on that? Any experiences with that? Any examples that you can provide to the audience?
I can't pull it up and share it, but I use a spreadsheet for ROI, and I sit down with the spreadsheet. It has metrics in it, and I sit down with my project team at the beginning and identify where do they see. So we have a brainstorming session. It's usually about 3 hours long, and we brainstorm where can we see improvement, whether it's through a PPI process or business and process, and have them identify what is the dollar value on that, or how do we calculate the dollar value on that, and that all goes into a spreadsheet and it's calculated out. And then we also identify when in the project do we estimate seeing those milestones and steps met that we would see that ROI.
And do you go back and look at that over time?
Yes.
Yeah.
And I actually do data analytics from project to project on it.
Okay. And has that helped from a process perspective to then build in better measurements for success as you go on to the next project?
It absolutely does. And using those measurements of success and communicating that back to users when we're starting a new project, here's what we've done and now already, and now we're going to build upon that, whether it's a new system that will be integrated or a new system that's targeting a pain point area in the business, is really helpful to be able to have those metrics to show and you have to have your metrics mean something to each audience that you're delivering it to.
Yeah, that's great. Tony, any other perspective you'd like to add on that?
Sorry, I was on mute. I love that idea of the communication with the end users, right? And always looping in with the end users, because at the end of the day, I think they're the ones who could really speak to, trying to put a dollar value on the benefits that they get from an application or don't get from an application, right? They're the ones who really kind of understand where the rubber meets the road.
Yeah, absolutely. So, if you were, if you're a new person that's about ready to take on a new project, what would some of the immediate steps would you have to suggest to these teams that are preparing for a software deployment? your lessons, your, key, we've talked about key success criteria, but what words of wisdom would you share with a new team getting ready to deploy a software, have a software deployment?
For me, it would be don't identify the solution without good user requirements. You need to really, and those have to identify their pain points. What is the change you're trying to drive through? So a good project scope of work will come out of that. But what is it's almost like a project charter at the beginning, but maybe not a full charter, but it really identifies the pain points. What are you wanting to change? What's the reason for the change? And what are the user requirements that have to be met? What do the users need? And having that at the beginning and having that really solid is really, really important. Your URS, user requirements document, will be a living document, so it will change and it will evolve. But having a good solid one to start with drives your scope of work, it drives the finishing of your charter, it drives your engagement with your users and your team.
Yeah. And how important that that's a living document?
Because you need to pivot and change as the business grows or pivots and changes. It's really important. It's vital, in my opinion. You can build upon it for upgrades, things like that. How's the user's requirements changed? What have they evolved to? I think it's really, really important. It helps you identify the best solution to meet the user's needs.
Yeah. And you mentioned, preparing the team and getting the team engaged. What's the best way to select those team members? Is there a formula that you've used that you've seen really successful in some of your implementations?
Asking for volunteers.
Yeah.
For your end user perspective, asking for volunteers, sending out surveys ahead of time to get critical questions answered to your users. And then a lot of times those users that reply and provide the most useful feedback are good team members that you can identify. This is somebody who's really invested and really interested in this. Voluntold is really hard. Sometimes you still have to do that, but it's really, really hard because you're adding on to people's work. If at all possible, take some of their workload off and assign it to somebody else. But it is, you really need champions who are going to be excited about it. And it's not a drudgery for them to be on the project team.
Yeah. Yeah. And Tony, what would those immediate steps be that you would give a new team getting ready to deploy?
Yeah. So making sure that business end user champion, right? Champion / SME is identified, right? Make sure you have that. And that person is committed to wanting to work on this project and passionate about it. I think that'll be almost number one. I think the next one on my mind would be it's in the space of requirements gathering. And just if you could structure the requirements gathering as much as you can, if you can sort of have a sort of a questionnaire or document a strategy to say, hey, these are the topics we want to talk about, and maybe what order it's going to be in or whatnot, and socialize that with people before the requirements gathering, right? Don't walk into the requirements gathering where it's the first time you're really going to be engaging them and talking with them about it. Let them think about it a little bit ahead of time as much as possible.
Yeah.
And then the last thing on my mind is maybe actively look for ways to stage a deployment, especially on something that's first of its kind.
Okay, that's really, really insightful. Paula, we've lost your video just in case you're not aware of that. So a question came up from our audience about how do you abandon a project, right? So you're into the development of a project, the user requirements or something has changed. How do you know when it's time to abandon a project?
Well, talk about upper management. I think at some point someone's gonna have to report that news.
Right.
I think when I guess at some point maybe the writing's a little more on the wall that the people are still struggling with requirements. They still can't really be well defined. Maybe it looks like whatever solution is never really going to be realistically capable of meeting the requirements. I mean, I think there's a couple of things you need to keep an eye on.
Yeah.
Good communication about why. Why was the company working on this project, and why the change? Why have we pivoted and moved away from that? What's the driver behind that? I realize that there's some things that companies are reluctant to put out there, but good communication with the end users and stakeholders is really important. How do you decide? Your project's going to have lots of bumps in it and struggles. It just is. Projects don't go perfect. But understanding, is this really going to meet the needs of the business? And if it's not, because the business need has changed or there's some other driving factor, making that decision as quickly as possible, because we don't want users and team members to feel like they've put in years of work and nothing's come to fruition and now all their hard work is gone. And making sure that team feels valued, and really your team members have to understand why the pivot, why the change.
Yeah, the why is so important. Yeah, yeah. So we're coming to the end of our time. Is there any last words of wisdom that you would each like to give to our audience as they think about taking the great information that you've provided and building it into their thought processes?
User requirements are critical.
Yeah.
Buy-in.
We're going to put a banner up over your picture, Paul.
Buy-in from upper management. Upper management has to be very supportive, whether they're a stakeholder on your executive committee or not. They have to champion the system. If they don't, if they talk it down, your users are never going to buy into it. Communicating with users, having user buy-in, making sure that they have a voice in the process is really important. Identifying requirements, I can't stress that enough up front. And how does that, and having IT at the table, because you're launching a system and IT cannot be an afterthought. And so many times IT is an afterthought. The business goes off, they do things, and then it's an afterthought. If you're moving from paper to an electronic system, set the tone up front. This is not going to work like paper, and it shouldn't work like paper because we need to improve our processes.
Yeah. Yeah. And how, how would you talked a little bit about engaging that upper management. What is the best way to get a proof of concept in place if we're trying to build in something new that you really need senior leaders to engage in? What's the best way to utilize the data, but utilize it in a proof of concept that would really help build that executive excitement?
Okay, well, I hope I don't lose too much of our audience, but I use Access a lot, or I use other visualization tools. But Access, you can really make it interactive, and you can flesh out a lot of things before you even put code behind it, to really get that understanding of what is this really meeting their requirements, what is the need here, and are we meeting the need? And helping them to be able to play with things and see things and go, oh, well, that's not quite how I envisioned it, because it really is hard to communicate what it is you're driving for and what it is you want and how you want it to function. A lot of times projects, especially software projects, in my experience, come out of users or going to management and saying, this isn't working for us. We need to have something changed here. But voicing what that change is really difficult. And then upper management, sometimes it feels like they're just popping balloons and going, okay, well, let's go this direction. Oh, the balloon tells us to go this direction, because they just don't have a clear understanding of how to solve the problem.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you. And Tony, your parting words of wisdom to a new team.
Yeah, again, just the idea of getting out of the abstract as soon as you can, right?
Yeah.
And that may involve a prototype, proof of concept, maybe a quick demo around it. Access, coincidentally, I love to use Access, right? And a lot of people wouldn't consider it sort of industrial strength. You're not going to put it out across an enterprise application, but it's relatively powerful. It's relatively easy to use. You could do a lot quickly in it. It's kind of one-stop shopping for pulling data in, querying, reporting even, right? You could do a little of everything with it.
Yeah. Okay. This has been great. I want to thank both of you very much. It's been very insightful, great dialogue. Debbie, I think I will go ahead and turn it back over to you at this point.
Great. Thank you so much, Suzanne. Thank you also to Paula and Anthony. It's such an interesting conversation. This group you have lots on your plate and lots to think about in your world. I very much appreciate you sharing your wisdom, and also thank you to Control Associates for their support. Meanwhile, to our audience, I hope that you found this program to be valuable. And meanwhile, if you did, and if you are a program or project manager in a BioNJ R&D member company, and you're interested in joining the BioNJ program committee, which Suzanne chairs, that committee explores topics of relevance to this community, like the ones we just talked about. You are more than welcome, and just please say the word, let us know. And if you are not a member, we welcome you joining us as a member, and also as a member of this committee if you are able to join us and you are a member of an R&D company. So Sherry Hennessy, our VP Member Engagement and Strategic Partnerships, would be more than happy to share the many benefits of membership along our 4 pillars of public policy, networking and education, savings for our members through our purchasing consortium, and talent services. We hope to see you at future BioNJ events. Our annual dinner meeting and innovation celebration is coming up on February 8th. We have the governor with us. It's at the East Brunswick Hilton. And we would love to have many of you with us as well. Visit bionj.org for our full calendar of events and a copy of this webinar, which will be up tomorrow. Also, you will receive an evaluation for today's session via email. We ask that you please consider filling it out. Your feedback is critically important to us and helps us to develop future programs. So thank you again to our speakers, and thank you all for joining us this afternoon. We hope you enjoy the rest of your day.